We are back now with the latest on the war with Iran, now approaching its sixth month. After weeks without any diplomatic progress, President Trump is threatening to launch what he calls an economic D-Day for Iran and promising tremendous consequences for any country that helps them evade sanctions. Meanwhile, Tehran is calling the threat of they called it economic terrorism, and promising that they will not bend to this. Let's get back to our group chat. I think you knew what I was trying to say there. David, the White House and Tehran seem to have entered this game of chicken.
Yes.
The threat of economic pressure on Iran, does it resonate at this point?
There are some experts I'm talking to this morning who are saying that there is a split among some of the civilian leadership is saying we should try to settle this war in Iran. But here's the problem with the economic pressure. The biggest force in keeping Iran's economy afloat is China. Mm-hmm. China buys the vast majority of illicit oil. It's all through intermediaries and all these things like that. So the question is, are President Trump and Scott Bessent willing to take on President Xi of China frontally? And I can't wait for you to answer this question. But that's the problem here, is the president has blinked when it comes to confronting China. He's done that over and over again. And he's also, I think, mishandled 5 months of negotiations with Iran, President Trump himself, by going back and forth and back and forth. So I'm not sure. I think the Iranians will wait and see if there actually is economic pressure that's brought to bear. Another big important place is the United Arab Emirates. They are very frustrated with Iran. They've been attacked throughout all of this.
They took proactive.
Yes, and what they are trying to do is actually they have their own ships with their own crews. They are going through running the gauntlet, and they say they're getting ships out through the Gulf. But that's the place to watch: is does China really stop buying Iranian oil, and does the UAE really stop all of its? There's tons of illicit trade also through the UAE.
So, David, jump in on this. China doesn't need Iran as much as Iran needs China, but still, they're trading partners. India, also a trading partner of Iran. These are theoretically U.S. relationships, allies, if you will. How does this play out?
So we're very close to this meeting between President Trump and President Xi that's supposed to take place in Washington. And I think that's looming large here and kind of speaks to what David's talking about, which is, will there be a reluctance to upset China at this point in time? I think the White House would want that meeting to go well because the economic situation with China right now still is so tenuous when it comes to trade and other issues. We've seen in recent months the U.S. push back on China. Then we saw that they could wield these rare earth minerals against the U.S. I think there's an awareness that China can play ball or make life harder for us here in the United States. Look, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was on CNBC yesterday. He talked about having this toolkit that he's going to reveal on Monday. We'll see what's in it. But picking up on what David was saying a moment ago, Iran is not a country that hasn't been subject to sanctions for a very long time, thousands of sanctions over many, many years. And so the question is, what else in that toolkit can be put to use? Yes, the China question is an interesting one. Turkey, India, all these countries could suffer as a result of placing more sanctions on Iran. But we really have used those weapons over and over again.
It's as if you teed this up perfectly. Let's actually listen to Scott Bessent, and we'll get your reactions.
You mentioned the president last night said that there's more economic pressure coming on Iran. I know you're heavily involved in this and executing this. What can we expect here?
Yeah, you're going to expect, I'll be holding a press conference on Monday to talk about exactly what we're going to do. And again, we have asymmetric information, and I'm not sure why oil has popped up on this, because this, for now, and it is at the president's discretion. If we are doing the maximum economic pressure, then that means that likely there will not be a large-scale kinetic restart. But I would emphasize that is for now.
Huh? I was trying to take that in. What is asymmetric information?
I don't understand.
You and I share a national security background.
Yes, so
I don't know what that means.
I don't understand what asymmetric information means. The president, to his credit, look, this administration, Donald Trump, is a messaging savant. Love him.
We are 74 days away from the midterms, and as we come on the air today, the midterms outlook for Republicans is growing more and more uncertain. The nonpartisan Cook Political Report just moved 2 key Senate races to Democrats' direction, now calling them both toss-ups. So it's not a guarantee, but they are toss-ups. And we're not just talking about swing states here that are in contention. We are talking about ruby red Texas, and we're talking about Iowa. It's been 38 years since Texas elected a Democratic senator and 18 years in Iowa. And speaking of Senate races, tonight, President Donald Trump will head to South Carolina. He's going to try to rally support for his handpicked candidate there, Senator Darlene Graham. The sister of the late Senator Lindsey Graham has been doing some damage control since saying in the debate that she's not that informed on national security. Many consider that to be a major gaffe. That Republican runoff between Graham and Ralph Norman is coming up on Tuesday. And as the Democrats try to build on their momentum in the final months of the midterm campaign, we could be seeing the downfall of the original Trump resistance. Stick with me here. Alexander Vindman is the latest example of Democratic candidates who fought against Trump during his first administration, during his first term, who couldn't even win their primaries. Now, with Trump entering lame duck president status, the Democrats who are picking up big wins are the ones who are laser focused on the issues like cost of living. It seems like voters still want candidates who will stand up to Trump, but they're now prioritizing the solutions to Trump policies instead of just the public defiance. Now, remember, we do want to hear from you. What questions do you have about the midterms, the economy, Iran, anything else you want to ask us? Scan that QR code right there on your screen and send us your questions. We will try to answer them later in this show. And with that, let's bring in our leadoff panel, MS Now congressional reporter Michael Schnell, who joins us from South Carolina this morning, Laura Barone-Lopez, White House reporter for MS Now, and Damian Paletta, Washington coverage chief for the Wall Street Journal and author of the journal's Politics newsletter. Michael, we are going to get to that Trump-Darlene Graham rally that's coming up where you are in just a moment. But let's start with this news from Cook Political Report. Texas, Iowa, now toss-ups. What does this mean for Republicans if those two states are in play?
Ariel, it's certainly not a good sign for Republicans, and of course it narrows their path to retaining the Senate majority. But on the other hand, it's a boon for Democrats. Look, this cycle, this map was seen as a difficult one for Democrats because of the states in play. But now having these two key red states now as toss-ups, it kind of gives them a glimmer of hope for any chances of taking the majority. I think that it's two factors at play here. First off, candidate quality, and then the political headwinds. Talk about a place like Texas. In that primary, a bruising GOP primary, Ken Paxton won over John Cornyn. Ken Paxton has a lot of baggage. He has a lot of scandals that he's constantly being asked about on the campaign trail. Democrats saw him as an easier candidate to go up against as opposed to John Cornyn, a conservative, someone who's been in the Senate for years and a fundraising juggernaut. By Democrats then getting Ken Paxton on the ballot, it makes it a little bit easier for them. And then they also have James Tallarico, a candidate who's caught fire both in Texas and nationally with some glitzy ads and the way he talks about issues. And then look at a place like Iowa. You have Josh Turek, the Democrat who's running in that race, who's had a good ad recently with President Obama, someone who is still revered in the Democratic Party. So certainly a year that looked like it would be difficult, almost impossible for Democrats, is getting a little bit attainable. The other thing here are those political headwinds. We always talk about the economy and affordability. Right now, with gas prices on the rise because of the war in Iran, that's not doing any help for Republicans as they try to retain these seats and retain these states. And Democrats are keenly aware of that, which is why they are messaging so hard and campaigning so hard on those gas prices. So look, there's still a toss-up. It still means it's anybody's game, but certainly a sigh of relief in a way for Democrats if they want any hope of taking the Senate majority.
So, Damian, I had been combing all of the publications, and what caught my eye was you have The Atlantic, Axios, Politico. All of them have headlines, I hope we have them for you, that are declaring essentially the death of Resistance 1.0 to Trump. What do you make of the narrative that the original Trump resistance is withering, whether it's Vindman, you saw Dan Goldman, and Democratic voters are now looking at a new wave of fighters that are focused on the solutions rather than just the fight itself?
Really interesting. I was in Atlanta last week with Hakeem Jeffries, and he was talking about what the Democrats' agenda would be if they do control the House in 2027. And he was not talking about relitigating, a lot of the past. He was talking about going after corruption for sure, but he was talking about being laser focused on the cost of living and the things that Americans care about the most. I think the way that President Trump is acting right now, he's already been impeached twice in his first term. It doesn't seem like he's that deterred or cares that much about that. In fact, Democrats would probably be really split if they had to make a decision about whether to do that again in 2027. I think Democrats feel like the one thing that unites them, whether it's the Democratic Socialists of America on the far left or the center of the party is a focus on the things that are going to get Americans, the majority of Americans and independents, to the ballot box in November. And that's things like the economy, the cost of living, and that's the sort of stuff that they want to kind of focus on going forward. And so they think that brings the party together. It's interesting to see, as you just pointed out, a lot of the kind of resistance Democrats from several years ago falling by the wayside. It looks like the Democrats and the voters are looking for fresher faces, and that's kind of what we're seeing in a lot of these states, whether it's in Iowa or even in Michigan.
And Laura, one thing that's for certain is that Democrats have had this advantage when it comes to massive turnout and enthusiasm during the midterm cycle. Is there anything that the White House, that Republicans can do to excite their voters with less than 3 months until the midterms?
Well, one of the things that you hear from Republicans or from
general, I should say, not the midterms.
right, is that they want. They wish that the president were out there more. I mean, Trump has not really been campaigning that much. We know he has the event today. Again, it is, though, in a state where this is not critical to maintaining Senate majority, and he hasn't really been doing much for any of the vulnerable House Republicans, for any of the other potentially more vulnerable Senate Republicans or candidates that are running in those key Senate races. And so, but Trump himself has said out loud that he's not on the ballot, and that he thinks Republicans themselves need to be doing more to win the races for themselves. And you hear that also from White House aides and from a former White House official I was just talking to recently, who said that Republicans have to take it upon themselves to win these races, that the president can't do it for them all the time. But of course, voters are responding to the president's agenda in terms of not liking it. I mean, across the board on issues where he has traditionally been doing well, whether it's immigration, whether it's the economy, and others, he is underwater. And he's not necessarily focused or doing anything to try to reverse that. We are still in the Iran war, and the president is changing strategy a little bit there, but there is no end in sight. And he is just this week, again, focusing on his project, showing a helipad, construction of a helipad on the south lawn of the White House, and again, talking about all of the things that he is doing when it comes to construction and leaving a legacy at the White House.
And yet the president, Michael, is going to head to South Carolina, where you are, to campaign with Darlene Graham. She looks pretty vulnerable after what we saw from her debate performance and subsequent attempts to clean up the aftershock from that. What are you going to be watching for in this race and from the president?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is, how does Darlene Graham continue to try and recover from that debate gaffe? Look, she has been a sitting senator for about a month now, and to say that she doesn't have experience in national security, doesn't know much about it, it is probably going to be a concern to voters. And I say that because I was here last week ahead of the initial election, and I heard from a number of voters who said they were voting for somebody other than Darlene Graham, despite the Trump endorsement, because they were concerned that she didn't have the right experience to be a senator, she didn't have the qualifications, and she hasn't shown a proven track record of being able to get things done in Congress. Now, Graham recently has said that she's not a politician. She has not shied away about that, but she supports the military and that she'll learn while on the job. But I'm curious to see if this continues to be a concern for voters, and does President Trump try to prop her up on that big vulnerability? The thing about that debate gaffe was that it wasn't a new idea. It wasn't a new concern. It just played into these concerns that voters have had and have been voicing. So that's the biggest question. The second one is the Trump factor here, right? President Trump is the one who asked Darlene Graham to run for the full term. He endorsed her. Now he's coming down 4 days before this runoff to try and get her over the finish line. It's a big question of, does he still have this grip on the GOP, particularly after those losses this week in Florida and Wyoming? And not to mention, Darlene Graham did come in first in the initial election, but more than 60% of South Carolina Republicans voted for someone else, somebody who Donald Trump did not endorse. So just as much as Darlene Graham has a lot on the line here, Donald Trump does too. And I think that you can sort of sense that the White House understands that, because he is coming down today to try to nudge her over the finish line.
Michael brings up an important point, Laura. You know, this may be a bellwether or a test of just how impactful Trump's endorsement really is. We've seen Trump-endorsed candidates have lost an unusually high number of primaries this cycle. He's already promoting his big midterms convention for Republicans in October. Both Trump, as you mentioned, and the Iran war, many of his policies are deeply underwater with the American public. So is he at this point seen as a liability or an asset when he's campaigning with these Republican candidates?
I think there are still a lot of Republican candidates who would prefer to have him out there because they see that when he is on the ballot, or at least in theory on the ballot, that they could potentially do better, that he does sway Republican voters. But the issue is that the president is not out there campaigning nearly as much as he did during his first term. He went out a lot during the midterms during his first term. This time he hasn't, despite the fact that the White House said last fall that he was going to do a massive economic tour, that he was going to make this pivot to focus on the economy. That pivot hasn't materialized. And the president, you see, posting what he posts about the most are his construction projects and are the fact that he thinks the elections are going to be rigged in November and that the 2020 election is rigged. That is what the president is focused on, and that's what he talks about the most, and that's what he posts about the most on True Social in his late night posting. So yes, there are Republicans that would like to see him involved more, would like to see more focus from the White House and from him specifically. But again, even though there are people in the White House who may say to the president that they should be addressing the economy more or addressing the fact that voters are feeling pain right now, the president is doing the opposite.
Let's talk for a second, Damian, about something that's occupying a lot of attention in Washington when it comes to the economy. There's a lot of talk about the national debt hitting $40 trillion. Here's what the Trump team had to say about it. Let's listen.
Yeah, look, the 40 trillion is a big number. Remember, we did not get here in a day. That we were left with a mess. The Biden administration had the highest deficit to GDP in history when we weren't at war or weren't in a recession. For 2025, we brought it down by more than 1%.
Even though the debt is too high, even though we inherited this debt bomb from the Biden administration, we actually do have a plan to get the economy growing faster than the debt, and that's the most important thing.
So let's quickly level set here. Let's fact check. In 4 years under Biden, the debt increased by $8.4 trillion. That is true. In 5.5 years under Trump, it's increased $11.6 trillion. Both Republicans and Democrats say they are concerned about this. This is a bipartisan problem about us passing this $40 trillion mark. What does it mean for Americans, and does anybody have an actual solution to this?
Well, they're all concerned about it, but no one's doing anything about it. I remember writing about the concerns about the debt when it was $14 trillion, 1-4, and now it's 4-0. I mean, yes, it actually matters tremendously because $40 trillion in debt means that the U.S. government is spending $1 trillion a year just on interest on the debt. Okay, that's essentially like another Medicare program or, more than the military budget on interest on the debt. And that's going to keep going up. What Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said and what the Vice President said, they do say they have a plan, but that plan cannot get through Congress the way they've envisioned it. The truth is the government right now is spending $2 trillion more each year than it brings in through revenue. So that's another $2 trillion in the deficit that goes to the debt. So the government debt's going to keep growing and growing. And like I said, that's just interest on the debt that's going to keep piling up. And the question is going to be how much longer are investors going to keep buying government U.S. Treasury debt when it's just piling up and piling up? And is there going to be a day when the U.S. government maybe can't make those payments? So it's not really sustainable, but really neither party sees any political interest in doing anything about it, because the only way to really tackle it could be raising taxes or cutting spending, and that's political suicide for Democrats and Republicans.
And so indicative of the political logjam that we find ourselves in Washington. Michael, thank you so much for your reporting out there. Everyone else is going to stick around with me. Coming up, the Trump administration sends its first deportation flight to Haiti after the Supreme Court stripped the protected status of thousands of Haitian immigrants. And it comes as ICE's aggressive arrest tactics face new backlash. And a reminder, Money, Power, Politics is coming to you live. Steph's first live audience show is slated for Thursday, September 17th. Mark that in your calendars. It's in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. See if you can make it. Scan the QR code on your screen and sign up for a chance to get a ticket. Money, Power, Politics is back here in 90 seconds. Don't go anywhere. The Trump administration has officially begun removing Haitian immigrants from the country after it won its legal fight to eliminate their temporary protected status. Yesterday marked the first deportation flight back to Haiti since the TPS removal. The Washington Post reports 170 people were on board that plane. Community leaders say it was one of the largest such flights they've ever seen in the second Trump administration. DHS did not respond to questions about that specific flight. Joining me now, MS Now reporter David Noriega, Laura and Damien are still with us. David, as we talk about the Trump administration's approach to immigration, you spoke to a man who says that he suffered a brain injury after a confrontation with ICE. What more do we know about his injuries, and what did you learn from him?
So, Ariel, this is a case that I think is worth paying attention to because it shows the extent to which ICE's aggressive street tactics have not, in fact, abated in recent weeks. This is a man named Jose Mejia Hernandez, who lives in Arlington, Virginia. He was walking to work early in the morning. His job is working as a janitor when he was approached aggressively by two men who jumped out of an unmarked car. He told me that sort of instinct took over. He ran away. He remembers being tased in the back and subsequently waking up in a hospital room with very severe bruises and cuts to his head and face. He got 7 stitches to his lip. He suffered a traumatic brain injury. He suffered a brain bleed. I've reviewed the medical records here, Ariel. And the main question, of course, is whether it makes sense for him to have sustained those injuries purely as a result of being tased in the back. He says that he does not believe he sustained those injuries purely due to the officer's efforts to restrain him. Or to prevent him from running away. And his lawyer says the same thing. I interviewed Mr. Mejia. I also interviewed the lawyer. When I spoke to the attorney, I asked him, whether he thinks that this kind of case is indicative of the general behavior that ICE and Border Patrol, that the federal immigration authorities are exhibiting as they go about arresting people out on the streets of American cities. Take a listen to what he said.
They're getting more and more aggressive, more blatant. And every time that we talk about this, it's getting a little worse. Every time that I get one of these cases, it seems like whoever's doing this knows, understands, or perhaps feels that there will be no consequences to them. The only way that you do this to another human being, and you are in law enforcement somehow, is if you feel that you have complete shield, complete immunity against anything that may happen to you.
Ariel, of course, we've had numerous instances in recent months in which ICE and Border Patrol agents have shot at, in some instances, shot and killed people during these interactions. And in none of those cases have we seen any kind of accountability for the agents involved. In this case, Ariel, the other factor, of course, is transparency. When I reached out to DHS asking them what exactly happened here, what kind of force was used against this person, why was that force justified, asking for any basic information about the incident, the response was characteristic of the kinds of responses that I get from DHS lately, in the sense that it barely included any information at all. They gave me a statement in which they said that agents used, quote unquote, necessary force to detain Mr. Mejia. They did not even admit to using the taser, which could theoretically have accounted for at least some of his injuries, and generally refused to answer any specific questions about this incident. Very quickly, last thing I'll say, Ariel, is Mr. Mejia was not detained. He was not put in a detention center, which is extremely unusual in this day and age when ICE is detaining absolutely everybody that it arrests. I mean, detaining for the long term until their deportation, everybody that it arrests. They're arresting and detaining sick people, pregnant people, elderly people, people with cancer, with all sorts of medical diagnoses. So the fact that they did not detain Mr. Mejia after doing whatever it is that they did to him is highly unusual. The lawyer, being speculative, of course, suggested that it might have been because they realized how severely they had injured him and were afraid of what might happen to him if he were in their custody, Ariel.
Boy, when you see his face, you see those disturbing images, you hope that the facts will emerge from what really happened there. Laura, I want to turn to you and talk about the White House winning its TPS fight over Haitian migrants. We've now seen that first deportation flight. What will these deportations look like from here on out?
Well, right now, the administration, DHS, is attempting to track down, put ankle monitors on them, or detain them, all of these hundreds of thousands of TPS holders that have been stripped of their status. The administration, has systematically looked at people who had lawful status and has then worked to take that status away from them. And this is all to reach those large deportation numbers that they want to reach, that Stephen Miller, the architect of much of this agenda inside the White House, the high deportation numbers that he wants to reach. So I think what we're going to see is them continuing to track down the people who had TPS, that they took TPS away from. And the thing about this population, Ariel, is that the administration has all of their information because these people had lawful status. Their addresses are known, their names are known. The administration, DHS, has much more information about them than, say, an undocumented immigrant with no criminal history, because they aren't necessarily in the immigration system and their information isn't necessarily in the immigration system. So this is a pretty easy population for the administration to find and to then deport. And we expect that more of those flights are going to be occurring in the coming months.
So, Damien, you have David's reporting on this latest incident and then the deportation of Haitian immigrants. As Laura points out, they're easy to find. After, of course, we've also seen federal agents kill 2 American citizens in Minneapolis. The White House has tried to change its tactics to some degree, keeping immigration policy out of the headlines. But a new poll from Politico shows that despite that perceived change, nearly half of Americans say that the mass deportations are just too aggressive, and that number is virtually unchanged from January to April. Has political damage already been done on this issue?
I mean, I think if you go back to 2015, this is the one thing President Trump's been most consistent about is immigration and deportations. And in the first term, it was about building the wall. And in this term, it's been all about deportations. And I think what we're probably going to see, now that the Supreme Court has made it a lot easier for him on the TPS holders, we're going to see a real push by the White House in the next few months to deport as many people as they can before the November midterm elections. Because if Democrats do get control of just the House or even the House and the Senate, it's going to be a lot harder. There's going to be a lot more scrutiny, a lot more investigations, a lot more Democratic control of the government's pocketbook. And so I think it's going to be a lot harder for the White House to continue this next year. And that's why we're going to see a lot more of this in the next few months, maybe even a more intensified push, because the time might be running out for them to continue doing this.
Which is so interesting because it runs counter to what Americans are saying that they believe when it comes to immigration, yet this was a winning issue for Trump way back when. So we'll see how all of this unfolds. David, thank you so much for your reporting. Laura, you too. Damien, thanks for joining us. Appreciate all of you. Coming up, after a lengthy deployment, the USS Lincoln is officially homeward bound. But with a new ship taking its place, there are new concerns about how to avoid yet another supply shortage on board. We're going to talk about that later. But first up, after this break, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says that he has a big toolkit to ease the bond market roller coaster. But so far, his efforts haven't worked. More money, power, politics coming up next. Let's get down to business this morning. Long-term interest rates on U.S. bonds are steadying after a turbulent few days. On Wednesday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced steps to try to bring down those rates as the national debt soared past $40 trillion, as we just talked about for the first time. But his efforts proved to be short-lived as rates started to rise once again yesterday. It's left investors unsure about what steps the administration could take next to try to lower the rates and what it will all mean for you, for us, for the consumers. I want to bring in Brendan Greeley. He is the contributing editor for the Financial Times, and Ron Insana, MS Now business analyst and publisher of the Message of the Markets on Substack. Ron, make some sense of all of this. Analysts have likened Bessent's actions to rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. You had another metaphor during the short break for this. Yeah. Is this like an act busy, do something moment?
Yeah, in a sense, it's kind of like spitting into the ocean and expecting a tsunami will result. I mean, it's a $32 trillion bond market. They're going to buy back on occasion $4 billion of 10-year notes and 20-year notes. What they're really trying to do is hold long-term interest rates down so mortgages don't go up, so car loan rates don't go up, and stop what has been going on, partly because of the $40 trillion debt, partly because of inflation and some other factors. Interest rates are spiking both at home and around the world, and they don't want them to spike further before the midterms. By the way, way, this program that he announced ends on November 4th, the day after the midterm elections.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Brendan, so what does this mean for the Fed? Does this complicate their job and the president's pressure to lower rates?
Yeah, the challenge is Scott Bessent right now is acting as the chairman of the Fed.
Yeah.
Kevin Warsh has made clear that he doesn't believe that he should communicate with the market in the way that previous Fed chairs have. We saw the consequence of that. What the market took from it is that he is not as committed to fighting inflation as maybe he should be under President Trump. Okay, the problem is that sent a signal to the bond markets that we're looking long term at inflation, in addition to a bunch of other things, the underlying fundamentals of the U.S. debt. So what you're looking at, Scott Bessent is trying to do what we call in monetary policy yield management. And Ron's right. We've all been sitting around, those of us who watch financial markets, trying to come up with the right metaphor. But basically, you cannot fight the bond market with a card trick. And that's what this is. It's a card trick. Scott Bessent said a crazy thing yesterday to Sarah Eisen on CNBC in an interview. He said that the prices don't reflect. Yeah, Sarah, mine as well. Amazing, among many other things, really good on Forex. But he said something that really caught my attention, which is that the prices don't reflect the underlying fundamentals. What? Yes. You can misprice maybe a municipal bond. The market can misprice a corporate bond, or for a small country. This is literally the biggest debt market in the world. It's the most liquid debt market in the world. There is no problem with price discovery and understanding of the fundamentals in the market for U.S. Treasuries. If the market sees something, it's there.
It's funny that Brendan brings this up because I wrote about this in my Substack yesterday, which is if a former hedge fund manager, now Treasury Secretary, says two things. Number one, that the bond market is not reflective of economic fundamentals, which we all know it is. And he doesn't understand why oil prices are up, given that there's a hot war ongoing with Iran. We have to question what it is that he's actually thinking about markets, how he views them, and what he's going to do about it. Again, buying back a small amount, a token amount of bonds to lower interest rates is not a strategy. It's something that should be a little bit disturbing to some people insofar as the real process here to bring down lower interest rates would be to reduce meaningfully the size of annual deficits and the gross amount of debt now at $40 trillion. It would be important for the Fed to meaningfully address inflation, which also is pushing up bond yields, and take into account some other policy mixes from the federal government, like lifting the tariffs, ending the war, that would take all this pressure off the economy and all this pressure off the bond market, which no one is attempting to do.
So, Brendan, the New York Times reports that AI industry is also driving up interest rates as companies borrow billions to build those data centers and other infrastructure. Yes, they are very controversial. We've talked about that. So far, investment in AI has been stimulating the economy, but is there going to be a turning point?
Man, I don't know. Who knows how to call that bubble? But I will tell you that, we got used to the privilege of low interest rates. And one of the reasons we got used to that is that there was a lot of capital sitting around chasing not very many good investments. With AI, I don't know whether it's a good investment or not, but it's certainly an appealing one. And there's a lot of money going into not just, private investments, but some of these companies are issuing bonds, right? And they're choking the market with people have options that they didn't have 10 years ago to put a lot of money into a big new project. Now, what Bessent has said, and I think this is interesting, is that we're going to see all the investment in American factories start to come online and increase productivity. The challenge is all that investment is actually going into AI. And we don't know what the story is with AI and productivity yet. It looks like it might increase productivity. We don't just know yet. So to go back to our original conversation, Bessent's making two bank shots. One is that AI will increase productivity. The other is he's said he'll be able to get tariffs back online next year as the administration moves forward. I don't know. That doesn't really seem like it's in his control. He can't really raise revenue without going through a lot of court cases the way the administration has for the last year and a half.
So, Ron, really quickly, let's just get to tariffs. Speaking of, tomorrow morning, Trump says that the new tariffs with Canada are going to go into effect, that they're still effectively negotiating this deal. There's some optimism on the Canadian side of things. Is there going to be a deal, and what does this actually mean for Americans? Well,
Prime Minister Mark Carney in Canada said there's still substantial work to be done, so we don't know if there's going to be a deal. They're talking about 50% tariffs on $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, on top of the tariffs that were imposed in the absence of the tariffs that the Supreme Court nullified. Now, the federal government has given back over $100 billion to U.S. corporations, which widens the deficit. So they're hoping to reimpose other tariffs that are maybe less legally questionable to bring that revenue back in. And so this is getting to be really complex, in the weeds type stuff.
Right.
Honestly,
so what does it mean for what Americans pay?
higher prices.
Higher prices.
That's it.
All right. There you go. Brendan, Ron, thank you as always. When we come back, no toothpaste, deodorant, or soap. Thousands of sailors and Marines reportedly went without basic supplies during their 9-month deployment aboard the USS Lincoln, as we've reported. My colleague Priya Sridhar dug into why those shortages happened in the first place, and she is going to join us with her new reporting when Money Power Politics returns. Grab your coffee. Come back. The USS Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier that has been on a 9-month deployment at sea, is finally heading back home to the U.S. from the Middle East. The USS George Washington, which is normally stationed in Japan, is arriving in the region has arrived as of Wednesday. Family members of sailors on board the Lincoln say that their loved ones have been dealing with deteriorating living conditions along with shortages of food and supplies. Now, lawmakers are demanding an explanation from military officials. Pentagon reporter for MS Now, Priya Sridhar, has been on this story from the very beginning, and she joins us now with more reporting. Priya, I think the big question so many of us are asking is, how could this have happened? You have the Pentagon budget that's topping $1 trillion. The war with Iran, according to the administration, is a priority. I know you have some new reporting on how and why these conditions materialized on the Lincoln.
Yeah, Ariel, it's such an important question, especially because the administration has been trying to deny that there were any deteriorating conditions or that there were any supply issues. But basically, this was all a result of the fact that Iranian missiles hit Bahrain, which is Navy's Fifth Fleet logistical headquarters. As a result of that, many non-essential personnel had to be evacuated from that base. And so it wasn't safe for the Navy's supply ships to go to Bahrain. The different other bases that they use in the Persian Gulf, like in Kuwait or the United Arab Emirates, were also within striking distance of Iranian missiles. So then they had two options. They could either get supplies through the Mediterranean Sea, but that was also unsafe because the Houthis were threatening to attack shipping in the Red Sea. So they had to pivot to Diego Garcia, which is this tiny island in the Indian Ocean about 2,200 miles away from the Gulf of Oman, which is where these two different aircraft carriers were stationed. And it's such a small island, it doesn't really have the capacity to take in the amount of supplies that you would need for two carrier strike groups. It's also so far away from any sort of landmass that you have to airdrop supplies into that base. And I heard from my sources that some of these supplies were coming from as far away from Hawaii. So the two big takeaways here, Ariel, is that first of all, the Navy does not have control over the Strait of Hormuz, so it's unsafe for a lot of these supply ships to get to the carriers. And also, we simply just did not plan that this war was going to be entering into month 6. This was supposed to be a few weeks, and so we just were not prepared for this to go on for such a long time.
So that raises the concern here. Is there any plan to make sure that that history doesn't repeat itself when it comes to the George Washington, to the USS George Washington, which is now replacing the Lincoln? Could they face the same types of issues?
Yeah, that's such a good question, too, Ariel. And also, I want to remind everyone that the USS George H.W. Bush, which is another aircraft carrier, is still over there. It's been there since April. And I think we're really going to have to see how this war plays out. If there's ongoing hostilities and airstrikes between CENTCOM and Iran, then it probably will be extremely difficult to resupply these ships. So we're going to have to watch that really closely. And I think that's why both sides, but especially the United States, want this war to end immediately. It's just unclear exactly how that's going to happen.
It is unclear at this point. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the next hour. But Priya, there is also new reporting about what's happening inside the Pentagon. According to the New York Times, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's wife, Jennifer, is one of the most influential advisors at the DoD, according to interviews with 20 former and current administration officials who know her. The Pentagon says that she's not been present for any Defense Department conversations or meetings that involve classified information. But what more can you tell us about the role she may be playing behind the scenes?
Yeah, this was such a fascinating article, Ariel. It seems like Jennifer Hegseth, who, by the way, was a TV producer for several years over at Fox News, is kind of serving as Pete Hegseth's top advisor, which is kind of bizarre because she has no national security or military experience. The article talks about how she's been included in Signal chats where Pete Hegseth has been talking about very sensitive military operations. And she was also included in a meeting with British defense officials where they were trying to talk about sensitive intelligence regarding Ukraine. And according to these sources that the New York Times talked to, the British defense officials felt very uncomfortable by her presence. The article also talks about how it was really Jennifer Hegseth whose idea it was to try to kick out some of these reporters from the Pentagon. And she was advised that legally it would be difficult to do that on an individual basis. So she could have been the reason that this Pentagon press policy was generated, which essentially restricted everyone from getting a badge because everyone refused to sign this policy. Now, the Pentagon, for its part, has doubled down on Jennifer Hegseth's role. Sean Parnell, who's the chief Pentagon spokesperson, said in a statement that Mrs. Hegseth is a devoted military spouse. She's a vital asset and a true force multiplier for our mission, and that the Defense Department not only welcomes her current leadership, but actively plans to involve her even more deeply in the future, Ariel.
How unusual is this, Priya?
It's extremely unusual. I mean, one of the Pentagon chief spokesperson who was working for Pete Hegseth previously and actually quit or was fired after the first 3 months called it bonkers. And anyone who's been covering the Pentagon or national security issues in the past says that it's extremely unusual for a spouse to have this much influence over the Secretary of Defense. It seems like she's taking an elevator into the Pentagon on a regular basis that goes directly into Pete Hegseth's office. And she's essentially by his side on a daily basis, influencing every one of his decisions.
Priya, thank you so much for your reporting on a wide scope of issues there at the Pentagon. We appreciate it, as always. And when we come back, the normal speed limit on the streets around our nation's capital, it's about 25 miles per hour, but this weekend it could reach up to 180. How the president is turning the National Mall into a racetrack to celebrate America's 250th birthday. Good morning. Hope you are easing into this Friday. It is 10 a.m. on the East, 7 a.m. out West. We are so glad that you are with us for the second hour of Money, Power, Politics. I am Ariel Reshef in for Stephanie Ruhle today. And it is now time for our group chat. The battle for control of the Senate is suddenly looking a lot more competitive. Cook Political Report is shifting two key Senate races in Texas and Iowa. Yes, you heard that right, which had been categorized as lean Republican to now being toss-ups. And these aren't the states that the Democrats are used to winning, of course. Texas hasn't elected a Democratic senator in 38 years. Iowa hasn't done it in 18 years. That now makes 6 Senate seats rated by Cook as the most competitive in the country, putting the 4-seat flip Democrats need within striking distance. So what's moving these races? Which voters are actually up for grabs? And are we looking at a few unusually close contests or the beginning of a much bigger shift in the midterm map? With that, let's enter our group chat, shall we? David Gura, host of Bloomberg This Weekend and the Big Take podcast. David Rode, MS Now senior national security reporter and Pulitzer Prize winner. Double the David, double the fun. Nikki McCann Ramirez, politics reporter for Rolling Stone magazine, and the one and only Chris Jansing, MS Now chief political reporter. Chris, I know that you've been talking to Democratic campaign officials in Texas, Alaska, Iowa. I mean, a lot of people may be surprised that we're going to start to see those qualify as toss-ups. What are they saying about the kind of momentum they're feeling right now?
Yeah, can we just talk about how crazy this is for a lot of people? Like
bonkers.
Iowa? Really? But there's a consistency to what they tell us, and it's not really going to surprise anybody. They say the anger is real, it's deep, and even the people who were like waiting because they thought, well, maybe the war will end and maybe prices will go down. It's clear that's not happening. So anger at the war, anger at tariffs, overall anger at high prices. And a spokesman for James Tallarico put it to me this way. He said, look, people are wanting, in Texas, the end of 30 years of one-party rule. So when you look at these deeply red states, the blame is going on to the Republicans. The question is how many of them will actually turn to a Democrat. Look, in Alaska, for example, when I was talking to some longtime political operatives there, they said, look, we have fish. Everything else comes from the lower 48. So the cost of the items is more expensive, but the cost of transportation to get them to Alaska is a lot more expensive. And so folks like Mary Peltola and Josh Turek in Iowa are walking this fine line, right? Because they want their Democratic base. They feel good about it, but they have to win over a lot of independents and Republicans. And so it's interesting to watch their ads. Take a little look at a couple samples of that.
Bipartisan bills to lower costs, tax cuts, gun rights protections. Just some of the more than 700 times Josh Turek voted with Republicans to look out for Iowans.
When both parties are attacking you, you're doing something right. Alaska first, always.
So a Democrat saying I voted 700 times with the Republicans. Look, all of this makes them feel good. Certainly these shifts to the, toss-up makes them feel like maybe some more money will come in, but they're worried about money. The big concern I hear over and over and over again is there's so much dark money on the Republican side. There are so many people who can write big multi-million-dollar checks. They're going to be looking at the races and looking probably around Labor Day. Where's that money going to go and who's it going to go for? So that's the big warning signal out there for Democrats. So what's their answer? For a lot of them, they have been building a big ground game. Even in Alaska, where it's not easy, you're literally taking dog sleds and getting on boats to do ground game. They have never seen numbers anything like this. 13,000 volunteers already, 43,000 doors knocked. And one more thing that I think is interesting, the way they're using this shift. In Iowa, they told me they have been going to Republicans and saying, by the way, we're up 4 points with Fox News poll. That gives it a level of credibility that they haven't had before when you see Fox News polls in these red states favoring the Democrats.
So, Nikki, it's interesting you mentioned the campaign ads because there was also a shift in how Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan is also changing his ads around a bit. Initially, they featured Bernie Sanders pretty prominently, and conspicuously, he has fallen out of those ads now. So what does all of this say, the changing landscape now that we're heading into the elections? What does it say about what kind of voters need to be targeted here in order for Democrats to pull out wins in these states?
Yeah, and I think we're going to see that shift across the country. Obviously, during the primary, you're presenting yourself to the core of your base, the people who turn out for more than one election a year, more than one election a cycle. So now it is shifting over to try and pull in those moderates, those independents. I think the story of these elections nationally isn't just anger at the Republican Party and the Trump administration. It's frustration with Democrats. And I think Texas is such a good example because if we think back to 2018 with Beto O'Rourke, who was the closest Democratic candidate to actually winning a seat there, part of the story that kind of got buried is that he had almost 500,000 voters who voted for him and also for Republican Governor Greg Abbott. What I hear from strategists in Texas, pollsters down there, pollsters across the country is that people's political affiliation is becoming a lot less fixed. They are less inclined to hard identify with a single party. So when you see candidates like Tallarico, like El-Sayed, who now are building very strong ground games, not just targeted as sort of the core constituency of the Democratic Party, the hyper online individuals who are debating every single soundbite and nuance. They are talking to people on the ground, going town to town, hour-long handshake and photo lines to make sure that they have face-to-face time with voters who are skeptical of them, but maybe willing to come over if they see, okay, this man isn't necessarily beholden to the national image I have of the Democratic Party.
David Road, I would love your thoughts. Sorry, I'm going to get to David Gura. It's not a slight.
Just do the whole
Actually, either one of you can take this at any point. I do want your thoughts on this reporting that it caught my eye. We talked about it last hour. It was Politico, Atlantic, Axios. I think the Washington Post also is in on it, saying resistance Democrats are flopping in primaries. The rise of DSA is killing off resistance 1.0. The resistance is over. Democrats are moving past the resistance. Are you sensing a theme here?
Yes, and I think it's people want effective governance. It's not that they just want something from the far right or the far left. Thank God you two are here because I don't really know what I'm talking about. One little nugget, which the producers flagged to read, is what's really interesting is what happened to the Freedom Caucus, the farthest right, the closest to Trump. They've been wiped out in Republican primaries. And in Wyoming, where actually the Freedom Caucus had the majority of the state legislature, they've lost control to other Republicans in the state legislature. They wanted to get rid of the state's small business administration. They wanted to take all these extreme steps. they thought this would be their year to get a supermajority. They've lost completely. So it just shows that I think both extremes aren't appealing. People want prices to come down. You would know best, Chris, from the field. And again, we're seeing the highest number of people identifying as independents that we've seen, I think, in more than a decade. And the numbers are coming away, it seems, more from Democrats. More Democrats are shifting to be independents than Republicans.
And David G., if you will, Chris was mentioning the money pouring into the Republican coffers. How important is money going to be when you saw in these primaries that many of these candidates are eking out wins despite being outspent?
I'm so intrigued by what you said just about how Republicans are going to deploy all this money. And so we've learned how much MAGA Inc., the president's super PAC or president's alliance super PAC, has in its coffers and how little of that he's deployed, basically none.
But it's individual billionaires who are going to come in.
So these are the big donors.
The concern by Democrats.
Democrats looking at kind of building that ground support of smaller donors. But going back to something that you mentioned a moment ago, it's this frustration, I think, with being asked for patience. And that's what this administration has asked Americans for from the beginning. It was with the tariffs, not explaining really in clear terms why they were putting those tariffs in place. And now you have the war. You have inflation, you have the debt looming so large. I think that a lot of people, picking up on what you said a moment ago, are just looking for some clear plan for what people in office are going to do going forward here. And it's really quite stark to me that that's not what this administration's offering. And I think that's why people are looking in other places.
And David, last night there was a Democratic primary debate in Massachusetts between Senator Ed Markey and Congressman Seth Moulton. I do want to listen to this because I think it speaks to this question of establishment versus insurgency, age versus youth. Let's listen, and we'll take a look on the other side.
And I'm running against the senator's decision after 50 years in Washington to run for another term at age 80, when one single missed vote could mean another conservative Supreme Court justice. I believe in a new generation of leadership.
Is there any age that's too old to serve in Congress?
Well, I think everyone watching this debate can see that I'm more energized than I've ever been before and in my life. I am crisscrossing the state. I'm fighting for families.
It's such an interesting dynamic here because Markey is the much more progressive of the two of them, but then you have the question of age and the question of frustration with the establishment. Can he survive that?
He's 80 years old. He's
running for a 6-year term.
Yeah, and he says he won't run again after that, so perhaps some relief to those who are worried about age. But he's done this before. The last time that he ran, he defeated somebody significantly younger than him. Member of the Kennedy family, no less. Yeah, I think that dynamic you highlight is so fascinating here, that in the other races we've seen here, the younger candidate tends to be the more progressive, less mainstream candidate. That's not the case this time around. You have Seth Moulton, who's a much more moderate candidate, and you have Ed Markey, who's really been held up as kind of an example of the more left-leaning part of the Democratic Party, championing a lot of causes from environmental rights to others. And I think, I think that it's become a less salient attack point from Seth Moulton than I think he thought it would be. And you look at recent polling here, it's not like this is a close race. And I think that was evident on the debate stage last night in Needham. He wasn't fighting what seemed like a very close race. He was fighting for really making up a lot of ground.
So, Chris, I do want to talk about Trump appearing with Darlene Graham in South Carolina. She clearly had a tough time, to say the least, on the debate stage, is dealing with immense fallout from her lack of knowledge of foreign policy, admitted lack of foreign policy knowledge. Is the president's backing, though, at this point, helping these Republican candidates? I see you shaking your head, so I'll get you in on it in a second.
So we see more and more candidates who he endorsed who are losing. But I think this is going to be a real test of the influence that he has in a state that he won 58 to 40%. However, if you look at the recent polls, his approval ratings are pretty evenly split, approve and disapprove. Look, we are a long way, there's no doubt about it, from Trump's endorsement being there you are, you're in a red state, you're fine. It's not that at all. And so the question is, does his endorsement, him coming there, actually hurt her? And the thing that's fascinating to me, remember at the beginning of this cycle when Susie Wiles, his chief of staff, said he's going to be out there, he's going to be doing all this stuff, and he hasn't been out there. So where is he going? He is going to a deeply red state. That's where he's spending his political capital, not in one of these close races. He's going to South Carolina.
It is interesting, and you wonder, does that speak to his deep friendship with the late Senator Lindsey Graham, or is there something more at play here? I know you wanted to get in on this.
I think for me, it kind of speaks to the way this president, his dealings with candidates remain transactional. You saw the same thing happen in Texas, where John Cornyn was clearly the stronger candidate by Republican standards, and the president tipped the scales in Ken Paxton's favors. I think in Darlene Graham's case, her connections to Trump, the fact that she was sort of selected by him, preordained by the party, is now being used by her opponent to paint her as the establishment candidate, to paint her as a Trumpian candidate who is in the pocket of corporate interests, who will simply vote reliably for the president's agenda. And I think a lot of Republicans are now finding themselves having to defend Trump's agenda in a way that is hurting them. And that's now being weaponized against Darlene Graham.
And David, I'm curious. You know, we saw, as you mentioned, Nikki, the race against Cornyn, the defeat of Cornyn. There was tons of money poured into that race. Are Republicans then just going to say, you know what, forget it with Texas? Ken Paxton's not a good candidate. We're going to leave that off the map?
No, I don't think so.
We're going to pour more money into Texas.
No, everybody with whom I've talked in Texas expects this to be.
Everything's bigger in Texas.
Yeah, but I think, Chris, you probably found this as well as you've crossed the country, that every one of these races, everyone is just kind of astonished by this kind of tsunami of money coming their way, and played a couple of those ads. I think these places are being inundated with those ads already. So there's something really dark on the horizon, pretending what they're going to be facing on TV going forward.
And an overwhelming feeling that there is diminishing returns at some point. There's only and in a state like Alaska, which has suddenly become so critical, as one Alaskan said to me, who's been in politics there for a very long time. This is not a state with 10 major media markets. It's not Texas with 20 major media markets. There's only so much money you can spend in some of these smaller states. And so you can inundate it, and nobody is saying they don't want more money. Let's be clear about that. Right. But again, they're falling back to some of the old-fashioned, tried and true. How do we connect one-on-one with people and let them know we understand the struggles that they're having and we're here to change it?
Chris Jansing, thank you as always. We should note also that Seth Moulton will be on with our friend Peter Alexander in just the next hour or so. So stay tuned for that after this show. The rest of the group chat's going to stick around. Chris, again, thank you for your reporting. Don't go anywhere. Up next, who will blink first? The standoff between the U.S. and Iran as President Trump ramps up his economic threats. We're back here in 90 seconds.